The shoulder shrug of death. I couldn't believe my eyes. Like, first of all, Greg coming in with the audacity. Information really is like a fine bottle of wine. You hoard it, you store it until you smash somebody's face in with it, which is what Greg did. He stabbed her right in the front. He's like, lady, you ain't got nothing for me, I ain't got nothing for you. So shout out to Greg. So these episodes take place day by day, and it's been less than a week since Logan has died, right? So that's something to keep in mind, and emotions are running incredibly high. As soon as Kendall sat down to talk with Shiv, I thought he knew. You know, it felt like he was testing her right at the start. He did not look convinced by Shiv's fake phone call, you know, that disconnected line. And there was a moment, you know, prior to this very pivotal conversation where it honestly looked like Shiv wanted to confess. You know, she had told Tom she was pregnant. She was, you know, kind of in a haze. And it really felt like she wanted to come clean, but she kept getting repeatedly interrupted. Greg is like the white rabbit at this point. Like, where Greg goes, attention flows. And I think the moment Ken figured it out is when he saw Shiv pull Greg aside when he came down to the floor. And I think his gears started turning. Ken is an interesting character because he was grappling with a lot of emotions. He was the least sort of, he was just like monotone this entire episode. He's supporting a candidate that he does not believe in or thinks he doesn't believe in, right? Or he says he doesn't believe in. The only problem is if he doesn't support this guy, then there's a very high chance that their company will be sold to Lucas. And I do think that Ken genuinely sees himself as a good guy. Like, this is a narrative that's been going on since season 1. And it seems like he used Shiv's betrayal to kind of justify, you know, siding with Roman and siding with a candidate that he clearly just doesn't like. And I think the thing I appreciate about the series is how tight it is. Like, every episode just feels like an audition for each of these kids to show us why they should be a successor. Right? Like, you get different glimpses into characteristics and traits that make you think that, you know, at one point we think Shiv can do it. Tonight, Roman really seemed to be the star. Maybe next episode it'll be Ken. Like, they all have these moments, right? Because they don't really distract us with outside characters, right? All these storylines, all these extra, you know, supporting cast members are meant to highlight these kids' kind of strengths and weaknesses. And there's what these kids think they should be and who they actually are. And this is starting to bridge, right? This is starting to, like, they're starting to see discrepancies, right? And in the case of Ken specifically, like, he's not a good guy. He's never been a good guy, you know, and Roman's never believed that he was a good guy. You know, he's always known what he was, and he was never confused about that. Whereas Ken is kind of like, he's had this delusion that if he's going to be successor, he's going to have to get rid of that, you know, and he's going to have to accept that, you know, he's a lot more ruthless than he gives himself credit for. And his reasons for being ruthless are not as selfless as he gives himself credit for. You know, this moment when it kind of dawns on him that Shiv could be portraying them, like, this whole family is poison, right? They're all just poison, and they'll do anything to get to the top. And I feel like Ken understands that on a deeper level. And so it kind of makes him feel less bad about his betrayal. You know, like, as far as he's concerned, like, they would do the same if they were in his shoes. And Shiv kind of showed that tonight. I also felt that Roman and Shiv were worried about the election the whole night, where Ken was just really worried about himself, right? Like, for Ken, he needs to be the one and only, one crown, one head. And there's really no point to any of these guys winning if he can't be the sole successor. And it just felt like everybody was covered in blood by the end of this episode, except for Ken, right? Like, it was a night for, you know, any leverage you had, you know, this was the night to use it. And Shiv put all her eggs in Lucas's basket. Roman put all his eggs in Jared's basket. And Ken, you know, he just looked like he just kept it clean. I'm going to start off with Tom and Greg. I was really surprised that Tom did not take this opportunity to kind of change things up a bit, right? He did exactly what he was told. You know, he proved himself to be a very loyal dog this episode. And I was also really surprised that he doesn't tell Greg about the fact that he's known about Shiv and Lucas this entire time. And I think by not telling Greg, he might have saved himself at the end. And so the episode starts with Tom and Greg is back to Gregging, right? And he's kind of sick of it. But for one night only, he has to just go back to being the bottom of the barrel. So Tom, right at the start, he's sleep deprived. He was fighting with Shiv the night before. Like, he's tired, he's exhausted. He doesn't really have much energy left. And I really thought, I was waiting for the moment for Tom to push back, to kind of say something, to do something, but he never does. And how he behaves determines whether or not his job is secure. But ironically, he's kind of strapped himself into like a nuclear bomb. Like, he could take the leverage that he has and go somewhere else. Instead, if this whole thing goes horribly wrong, he'll end up getting fired for it anyways. You know, that's kind of funny. Like, in trying to secure his job, he might have nailed his own coffin. So apparently Greg had such a wild night out with Lucas. Like, apparently this stuff was crazy. And he saw a lot that he wants to unsee. He learned a lot that he keeps trying to strategize with Tom, right? He's like, listen, I really got to tell you about all the crazy shit that I saw. But Tom was tired. He's like, I don't got time for this. We can talk about this another day. But whatever happened between Lucas and Greg, it was enough for Lucas to be calling Greg during this election night, because at some point during this episode, Shiv calls Lucas, and Lucas mentions something about, well, Greg doesn't agree, or something about Greg. And that's what gets Greg's head like nearly cut off. But Greg is in, you know, he's in with Lucas's team, and he's sitting, you know, quite comfortably. At the start, ATN seemed open to both sides. Both teams were keeping an open line of communication. And, you know, it seemed okay at first. And the only difference was that Roman was the only person on solid footing, right? Shiv isn't really all that tight with Nate. And Ken isn't really tight with Nate either, or, you know, this other candidate. So they're kind of just trying to figure something out. Ken's conversation with this Jimenez, that was so awkward. You could tell they wanted nothing to do with him. They didn't want to be anywhere near him. So their only hope, even if they don't want to admit it, is whatever Roman has going on with Jared. Roman and Jared have such a tight bond to the point where Jared literally invites him over. And it seems like Jared was really interested in maintaining the bond, right? He's like, listen, even if I lose, keep that narrative going. We can still work together. Like, we can still be bros. Like, we can still kick it. Like, I just want you to know you're a true friend. Like, he was just really like making it clear that Roman is somebody he wants to work with, regardless of the outcome. And Roman is like, okay, that's fine. And I think Roman is sad because his father died days ago. He might be in the market for a new father figure. Like, you know, maybe his connection to this man is a bit overly emotional. But I mean, these two, like, their bond is tight. And I have to say, like, Roman was very impressive this episode. Like, very, very impressive. He made decisions. He was very dynamic. He was very sure of himself. The only danger that he has is to end up like Shiv at the end of the episode, right? He put all his eggs in one basket, and if this goes horribly wrong, I mean, his head is cut off. But Roman, he did not sink, actually. I thought he was quite, you know, he was making moves, and they were really good moves. So Roman is the only person that understands that it's like do or die, right? Like, their only viable option is Jared, because without him, they can't really convince anybody that this company is worth more than what Lucas has offered. And if they lose, then they look like the value of ATN goes down, because you just basically spent the last few months, the last few days aggressively promoting a candidate that lost, right? So their credibility as a news organization is tied into their value. Right? And Roman's like, listen, we need to go all in, because this is all we got. So watching this like election process, like, it's not really a democratic process, right? Like, I love how all of them were trying to hide behind what's best for the country. Like, it was kind of nonsense, right? Like, who is it that they can do business with, right? For Shiv, it's Jimenez. For Roman, it's Jared. For Kendall, it's at this point nobody, because he's not trying to share this crown. But they kept trying to like make it seem like they cared about the country. And Ken in particular, right? Like, the only reason he doesn't really like Jared is because he's close with Roman, right? But at the same time, he can't really build a relationship with the other team, so he doesn't really care, right? So I love how they were trying to hide behind caring about the country when really they were just trying to pick the person that best suited whatever it is they were trying to do. And I think Logan would never have been in this position. I think the smart thing to do would have been to kind of appease both sides and keep it balanced until a winner was clear. You know, that way, like, you have open lines of communication. But by the end, you know, they're kind of forced to go with one line of communication. And I don't think Logan would have put himself into that type of, like, corner or box. From the beginning, you know, ATN has been pro-Jared. I thought it was really suspect that Tom was pro-Jared, you know, but that makes sense because he didn't really like Nate. For him, there's no interest, right? He just needs to be doing his job in a way, like his political interest is keeping his job, right? And that's compromised when Shiv tells him that she's pregnant. And this conversation is so awkward, right? It's very awkward. And I think we have to remember that Logan died maybe a few days ago, according to these episodes. They're going day by day. So at the moment, Shiv, Roman, and I don't know about Ken, I can't really read him, but they have this, you know, grief for their father, this love for their father that's not really true to the reality of the relationship that they had with him. Because Tom says it best. He's like, you sort of killed your dad, right? You put him on a plane to Sweden to negotiate for you. You know, maybe you loved him, but you also, like, kind of hated him and you didn't really like him. So taking your anger out on me, that ain't it. You know, and that's a part that they're not, like, the wound is too open for them to kind of address that. But Tom not believing that Shiv was pregnant, like, you could see at the end, like, his face, like, he believed her. You know, like, he was having a mix of emotions due to sleep deprivation. Also, the way Shiv just dropped that bomb, like, oh, by the way, I'm pregnant by you. I think Shiv was hoping to work with Tom, you know, and I think she was hoping that he would kind of bow down to her and be like, oh, honey, it's okay. So Tom wasn't pandering. You know, I was also impressed with that. Like, he didn't really pander to Shiv. He didn't really, you know, try to make her feel better like he normally does. Like, he was kind of emotionally done. You know, he was tired and he's just focused on securing his own job because Shiv hasn't really done much for him. But this news about the pregnancy, it changes quite a bit. So the turning point in this episode is when we find out that one of the voting stations in Wisconsin was burned to the ground. Like, there was some sort of, like, attack, some type of issue there, and they lost over 100,000 votes. And this becomes the critical moment where ATN has to decide, are they gonna, like, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna keep both lines of communication open, or are you just gonna put all your eggs in one basket? And, you know, watching the behind the scenes, like, it's assumed that had this disaster not happened, the Democratic candidate would have won, right? Like, that's kind of the default assumption of everybody. But because nothing is 100% known, and Roman is really pushing, ATN makes the decision to call a state for their candidate, right? And the moment they called Wisconsin was the moment that I'm pretty sure Nate cut off his phone, like, changed his number. Like, at that point in time, like, they were done, right? Like, they kind of made their bed and they had to lay in it. And one of the funniest scenes is when Roman is trying to convince them to call Wisconsin, right? And this guy Darwin, like, as if his name is Darwin, is like, listen, we can't call it, call it. And again, I thought Tom was going to step in and be like, guys, you are crossing a line. Instead, they play with language, right? Like pending call. But they just called it. Like, that's what I understood. And the funniest scene was when, you know, Darwin got wasabi in his eyes. Like, and then he tried to pour it out with this, like, lemon soda. And then he started drinking it. Like, that just killed me. Like, the fact that Greg was like, oh, it's not that bad. Like, he just doesn't care. Right? Like, he's just casually minding his own business where everything is just, like, falling apart around him. Now, if you watch this episode, everywhere Roman went, Shiv went too, right? Roman was trying to convince them. Shiv was right behind him trying to, you know, tell her side of the story. And watching Roman and Shiv just go back and forth, watching Tom essentially babysit them, like, they kept going on the floor and they kept having to be escorted off the floor. Like, there was a funny moment where Greg was trying to, like, escort them up, and Greg was like, or like Roman was like, get away from me. Like, they just look so awkwardly placed on the floor because they weren't really doing anything. They were just wandering and trying to find something to do. And you know, they're trying to just like isolate them so people can work. Like it was just funny. The minute Wisconsin is conceded, there's some momentum here, right? Like the ATN was able to create a narrative that was both entertaining and, you know, had some impact, right? So they were able to kind of create an image that, you know, maybe he can win, right? And they kind of, it was so explicit and it was so in your face. And I love the scene of Connor conceding as if anybody cared, as if somehow Connor conceding added to Jared's momentum. Like that was so funny. Like he was standing there. Now he wants this ambassadorship. Honestly, an election is more interesting when you're running, but he was just like doing the most, right? He's like, America beware, the con heads are coming. Like, you know, I think, what did Frank said? Oh, is Connor running for president? Like, this doesn't add anything, but it, like, at face value, you're like, oh man, now Jared has Connor's supporters, but it's like, what supporters? You know, like, alas, Kentucky, alas forever, Connor. Like, you are like sayonara. The way ATN, you know, behaved, it was quite despicable, right? Like, while every other news network is trying to keep it calm, trying to keep their facts, ATN was like, we're gonna call it, you know, and they didn't really give attention to all these things that were happening that would call this, you know, parts of this election into question. And I think because they seemed so sure in their narrative, it just made them come off as very confident and as a very reliable news source, even though they were just acting, right? The whole thing was so performative. Ken is like this, but he is just watching from his little glass tower. Like he is just trying to decide, right? He's having issues at home. You know, he has an adopted daughter. It seems like she's been having some problems at school. All these problems will escalate if this guy wins, right? And there's a moment in the episode where he calls his daughter and, you know, he tries to be like, listen, you know, like all of this will be over. Like, don't worry, he won't win. Like, so he's kind of conflicted. I think one of the best lines that Ken had was, you know, it's kind of a nice idea, all the different people like together, basically referring to Jimenez if he wins. Like, it would be kind of nice to have all the different people together. Like, he's so annoying. So Ken has an idea of what kind of values he should have. Like, that's the problem with all these kids. They have an idea of what kind of person they should be, and then there's the kind of person they are, right? And Ken is starting to learn that, you know, he's not maybe this good guy he thinks he is, but he's fighting hard to keep that narrative. And there were so many moments where I really thought ATN would revolt, because you could tell that the people behind the scenes were super uncomfortable with everything going on. And, you know, there was even a moment before I realized it was Roman's talking points where the anchor starts going off, doing his own thing. And then when you listen to what the anchor is saying, you realize, like, oh my God, like, they're really backing this Jared guy. And again, the contrast is like, they have an agenda, but not everybody's fully on board with this agenda, right? But nobody wants to lose their jobs and their careers are on the line. So in the end, they just gotta do what's best for them. I think there's what you do and how you do it. And ATN put itself in such a weird predicament where their legitimacy was at stake, right? Like, if they didn't win, if this guy did not win, they would be done, right? They would have no value. And honestly, Lucas could probably lower the offer and, you know, get the company for less. There's this attitude with Roman, you know, like with all the kids, it's like you're either with us or against us, right? Like, they're not really, you know, I think what made Logan really smart is that other people had to convince him to side with them. Whereas these kids, they don't really know how to do that. They're just kind of like, listen, this is what we're doing. Either be with us or against us. So they don't really know how to play both sides effectively. And nobody really wants to pander to them like that because no one really respects them. So they just kind of put themselves in such a corner that they can't really get out of. Talking about the lead up to that explosive conversation, I think the moment Ken figured it out is when shortly after Roman's talking points, he comes downstairs and he sees Shiv pull Greg aside. And his spidey senses just started to tingle, right? And I feel like he's been looking for reasons. He's been looking for a sign, you know, like he's been really contemplating what is best for Kendall, Like, how am I supposed to move forward? All Shiv had to do was lie to Greg, right? She pulls him aside and she just starts threatening him. And Greg wasn't really in a good state of mind, right? Like, he's been kind of demoted. He's back to being Tom's, you know, boy, basically. And he's just kind of had it. And Greg asks a good question, you know, like, how golden is my silence? Like what's the offer? You know, and this conversation was so awkward because she's threatening him. She's, you know, the disgusting brothers. Like, she's talking to him as if, like, she hasn't seen Greg grow. You know, Greg has come a long way. I think that would have worked in the first season or even maybe last season. But Greg has come a long way and he's just done, right? He knows where the power lies. And if you ain't offering him nothing, he's not going to take anything. And so, to be honest, I would have done exactly what Greg did because there was nothing. You know, you kind of put me in a room, you treat me like a child, and then you kick me out. Ma'am, revenge came quick for Shiv. I mean, that turnaround was like a boomerang. So Shiv failed with Tom. She failed with Greg, and now she was about to fail with Ken. I really believe that Ken knew that Shiv was a rat even before he came into the room, right? He says to her, like, he kind of confesses so openly and so comfortably, almost knowing that even if she were to repeat back what he said, no one would believe her, right? He kind of makes it clear. He's like, listen, I'm kind of thinking I want to be the only CEO. I don't really want to ruin this family thing, but, like, honestly, I just really want to talk this out. He even admits that he's threatened by Roman's friendship with Jared, you know, with this future president. Like, he's really letting his heart spill in such a way as to basically tell her, like, listen, nothing you do can hurt me, so let me just get this off my chest. And he also admits that he was not a very good father, which he's not. You know, and I love how Shiv tried to console him, like, you tried. Like, you're okay. But he's not. Like, we've never actually seen Ken be a father. And it's awkward. The whole thing about poison dripping down. You know, Shiv thought he was talking about himself, but I think he was talking about Shiv, right? Or maybe he was talking about both of them. And, you know, it's very clear that these kids will do anything to kill each other. And I think the moment that Shiv fumbled the ball was when she called him a good guy, right? Oh, and you're really a good guy. And Shiv's acting is not convincing, right? And I feel like Ken could see right through it. Like, she was so fidgety, she was so weird. Like, it was not, you know, you're essentially a good guy, like, basically saying you're not that good of a guy, but I'm just gonna say it because your ego is so big, and I'm basically gonna appeal to it. And the whole time Kendall is talking, right? It's like, so we all want to take down Lucas, right? Right? Like, can you do me a favor and call Nate? Right? I really feel like it was a setup. Because there's no way that Kendall would not have tried to call Nate one more time to see if there was a possibility of rebuilding this friendship. Because they show Ken watching Shiv take this fake phone call. And he looked like I got you. Like, the way he was just standing there, like, he almost couldn't believe his eyes. Like, he almost couldn't believe, like, the audacity of this woman. And we get to the final blow up. Like, this scene was so perfect in so many ways. Like, and I just want to say, like, Roman is a very, very well-written character. Like, his mannerisms, his inability to sit down, the way he mimics and taunts Shiv towards the end. Like, he's just like this. Like, he's like a little, I don't know. He's just a ball of energy. And he's totally in the dark, right? He has no idea what's about to go down. But I bet everything Kendall did. The moment of truth. And they need to call this election. And the only way they can maybe consider waiting it out is if there's hope that this Democratic candidate might kill off Lucas's deal, right? Because they have word that Jared is on their side. They need just something. And Shiv straight up lies. You know, she's like, yeah, you know, it's looking encouraging. Oh, it's looking this and that. You know, like, she's really trying to make it sound like there was a possibility, but she was being super vague, not that specific. She honestly sounded like someone who did not talk to anybody on the phone. And Roman, you know, right away, he's like, this is BS, right? And again, there's so many signs where I really felt Kendall knew, because just before Kendall makes the phone call, Shiv tries to stop him. And he's like, wait, why? Is there a reason I shouldn't make this phone call? Like, is there anything you want to say, Shiv? And then he goes outside, and we don't know what happens, right? We don't know if Ken even dialed the number, We don't know what he said to Greg, but their eyes were locked on each other. And that was it. You know, that moment when Greg just shoulder shrugs her and walks away, that's when I knew her nail was coffin. Her coffin was nailed. You know, and she was done. And then everything just explodes from there. Ken is a very holier than thou character, right? He insults her. You know, he goes in on her. He went from defending her from Tom earlier in the episode to just going in on her character. You piece of dirt, you this and that. And I think it helps in terms of solidify his bond with Roman. You know, like, she's now the odd man out. That is one person that he's totally taken out and he wants out. You know, he did it with no remorse. He didn't really care. And they make the decision right then and there. I thought it was so petty that Roman was like, oh, just because you broke up with your boyfriend, like, that's her husband. That's not her boyfriend. And, you know, it became a boys' club, right? Like, Tom comes in the room and he listens to Roman and Ken directly, right? He calls the election. He does everything they say. He doesn't side with Shiv. He doesn't do anything. And I honestly don't think Ken knew about Tom because Greg doesn't know about Tom, right? And I'm sure Ken asked Greg, like, is Tom in on it? And Greg said no. The episode ends with Greg going downstairs to kind of give them the news that they're going to call the election. And there's a very nice moment where, you know, Jess stops Greg, right? It's almost like she's trying to convince him not to call it, as if Greg has some power. And the atmosphere of this whole episode is that nobody wants this guy to win. Like, it seems like everybody's very uneasy with this man winning. Like, he's to the right of the right. He even makes the right uncomfortable. And Greg says it doesn't really make a difference if I go down there or not. Like, it's still going to be called, right? And it was just such a moment where you could tell kind of the atmosphere, or like of the people on the other side, like how much agony this is causing, right? Like, she doesn't really know what to say to Greg. She's like, just a few more minutes, like, as if that's going to make a difference, right? And Greg goes downstairs and then he tells them to call it. So this is a very long process. It's not going to be over apparently for 3 months. Like, they're still going to have to deal with those burned ballots. And I love how in the end, all the other networks were showing Tom's face as the man fully responsible if this goes to hell. We get Jared's victory speech, and his speech, like his mannerisms, he takes after Donald Trump quite a bit. Like, the way he leans in, the way his mouth moves, like, you know, he's like a better looking Donald Trump, you know, except he believes what he's saying. Like, a lot of what he was saying was very, you know, he was making it clear what kind of person he was, what his dreams are. But I just felt like the way he was moving, like, it was very Trump-esque. I don't know. But I think the moment in his speech that killed me when he was like, when he said an authority of known integrity has called the election, meaning ATN, which at this point has no integrity at all. So the atmosphere at the end is not celebratory at all, right? Like, that's the thing. Like, everybody just felt defeated. Like, it didn't feel like post-election. It didn't feel like a news network that had done its job. Like, everybody just felt like they couldn't wait to go home and for this nightmare to end. The only person who was relieved was Roman. Like, he got a call from the president, and this Jared was like, yo, thank you so much. Like, I knew you had my back. Like, they were really friends. And Kendall was jealous. Like, he was looking at Roman like, I gotta cut this off fast, but I don't know how, I don't know when, but I'm certainly thinking about it. And there's this awkward moment with Shiv in the back, right? Like, her final words, like, things do happen. And she storms out of there, right? With Jared's face in the background as a winner. And I think Shiv is out, you know, in terms of a successor, she's not going to be the successor, right? She got knocked out. The fact that Lucas wants to keep these terrible numbers a secret, like his fake numbers a secret, doesn't help. You know, it's not looking well. Like, Lucas was just not the person to back. Something might happen at the end of the episode, but who knows? And the final shot is with Ken trying to convince his ex to see his daughter. And there's a line at the end where he's like, I guess some people can't cut a deal. And I think he was referring to himself as like being unable to see his daughter, right? So I couldn't tell with Ken. Was he referring to Jimenez? Was he referring to himself? Like, I think Ken was, he honestly didn't have a solution by the end of this episode. Like, he got rid of Shiv, but Roman you know, he was very capable this episode. He didn't really crumble under the pressure. And that leaves Ken feeling a bit uneasy. A bit uneasy. And, you know, that episode was really a great night of television, as Roman said. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.